Al Pacino tried to humiliate Clint Eastwood on live television, right there on the Tonight Show stage, in front of Johnny Carson, in front of the studio audience, in front of 30 million Americans watching from their living rooms. And Clint did not raise his voice. He did not stand up. He did not look to Johnny for help or signal his team, or do any of the things a man with that kind of pride could have done. He sat completely still, looked at Al Pacino across that famous desk, and said 6 words that made every single person in that studio forget how to breathe. 6 words that were not angry, not rehearsed, not designed for a camera or an audience or a moment in television history. 6 words that were just true. Tonight, you are going to hear every word of what happened on that stage. What led to it. What was said. What Johnny Carson did when he realized what was unfolding in front of him. And why those 6 words still matter to every single person watching right now. Stay with me, because this story is not what you think it is. But before starting our video, I'd like to say something. I often see comments from people who did not realize they were not subscribed. If you enjoy the channel, please take a second to check and make sure you are subscribed. It is free, and it really helps us keep the show growing. Thank you for being part of this journey with us.
October 1993. 6 months after the Academy Awards. Unforgiven had swept the Oscars. Clint Eastwood had walked away with Best Picture and Best Director. Al Pacino had finally won his first Academy Award for Scent of a Woman after 8 nominations and 30 years of waiting. By any measure, both men were at the absolute peak of what their careers could offer. Johnny Carson had retired from The Tonight Show in May of 1992. But what most people do not know is that in October of 1993, Johnny agreed to host one special evening of The Tonight Show as a charity event for the Broadcasting Hall of Fame. One night only. His first time back behind that desk since his retirement. The booking alone was the biggest television story of the year. Johnny Carson returning to The Tonight Show stage. And the producers, knowing this was a once-in-a-decade moment, spent 3 months putting together a guest list worthy of it. Clint Eastwood agreed immediately. He and Johnny had been friends for decades. The thought of one more night at that desk, one more conversation with a man he genuinely respected, was something Clint could not say no to. Al Pacino agreed 2 weeks later. He had appeared on The Tonight Show 4 times over the years. He trusted Johnny. He wanted to be part of the night. Nobody told either man that the other would be there. And nobody knew that what had happened between these 2 men 6 months earlier at the Academy Awards was still very much alive. But here is what you do not know yet. And it changes everything about what happened on that stage. To understand that night, you need to understand what had been building between Clint Eastwood and Al Pacino for years before either of them ever walked into that studio. In late 1989, a screenplay was circulating through Hollywood with the kind of quiet intensity that only serious material carries. A Western. A character study about guilt and redemption and the cost of violence. Dark, morally complex, the kind of project that terrifies studios and pulls at actors the way gravity pulls at everything. Clint wanted it. He read that script in one sitting at his kitchen table in Carmel and sat in silence afterward for a long time. He called his producer the next morning and said 4 words. "I need this film." Al Pacino had read the same script. A meeting was arranged. A lunch in Beverly Hills. Just the 2 of them. 2 of the most powerful actors in American cinema sitting across from each other in a quiet booth discussing a film that only one of them could make. The meeting lasted 40 minutes. Clint left first. 3 weeks later, Clint Eastwood announced he would direct and star in Unforgiven. Nobody spoke publicly about what happened at that lunch. Nobody except Al Pacino. Once. Privately. To a director he trusted. And that director, years later, described what Pacino said using words that made everyone in the room go quiet. He said Pacino felt dismissed. Not professionally. Personally. Like the other man had looked right through him and made a decision before the food even arrived. Al Pacino had been carrying that feeling since 1990. Through the entire production of Unforgiven. Through awards season. Through the night he finally held his own Oscar in his hands and should have felt nothing but joy. He was still carrying it on the night he walked into NBC Studios in Burbank and found out that Clint Eastwood was already in the green room. What happened next is something The Tonight Show has never fully recovered from. Keep watching. The green room at The Tonight Show was not a large space. 2 leather couches, a coffee table, a monitor showing the stage feed, a small bar cart in the corner. The kind of room where you could not avoid someone even if you were trying to. Clint was already seated when Al Pacino arrived. The stage manager later said that the moment Pacino walked through the door and saw Clint, the room changed. Not loudly. Not with any visible confrontation. Just a shift in the air, the way a room shifts when 2 people walk into it who have something unfinished between them. They were civil. Brief handshakes. Minimal words. Johnny had not arrived yet. The producers moved carefully around both men like people navigating furniture in the dark. When Johnny finally came through the door, he read the room in about 4 seconds. Johnny Carson had spent 30 years interviewing human beings for a living. He could feel tension the way other people feel weather. He pulled his producer aside and said something quiet and direct. "What is happening between those 2?" The producer told him what he knew. Which was not much. Which was the outline of a professional disagreement and nothing more. Johnny nodded slowly. Then he walked over to both men separately, shook their hands, spent 2 minutes with each of them, and went back to his dressing room. The show began at 11:30. Johnny's monologue was the best anyone had heard in years. The audience was electric just from being in the room with him again. Every joke landed. Every pause hit exactly right. There was something about Johnny behind that desk that no amount of retirement could diminish. He was home. Clint came out first. The audience gave him a standing ovation that lasted nearly a full minute. Johnny stood to greet him, which he rarely did, and the 2 men embraced like the old friends they were. For 20 minutes they talked about Unforgiven, about the decade-long fight to get it made, about what it meant to finally hold that Oscar at 62 years old and know that every studio that said no had been wrong. It was warm and easy and exactly what great late-night television is supposed to be. And then Johnny said, "Clint, I want to bring out someone I think you know. Ladies and gentlemen, Al Pacino." The audience erupted. Al Pacino walked through that curtain in a dark suit, moving with the particular energy of a man who carries every room he enters. He shook Johnny's hand. He turned to Clint. They shook hands. Clint nodded. Al sat down. For the first 5 minutes, everything was fine. Johnny was brilliant at navigation. He moved the conversation to the Oscars, to what that night had meant for both of them, to what it felt like to stand at that podium after a career like theirs. Both men answered graciously. The audience was loving every second of it. But Johnny Carson had spent 30 years reading people on live television. He could see something beneath the surface. He could see it in the way Al Pacino was sitting. Slightly forward. The particular stillness of a man who is waiting for the right moment rather than simply enjoying the conversation. Johnny tried to steer toward safer ground. He asked about upcoming projects. He asked about New York versus Los Angeles. He asked about the craft of acting, which was always fertile territory with both men. And then Al Pacino said, "Can I ask Clint something?" Johnny paused for just a fraction of a second. The kind of pause only people watching very carefully would notice. "Of course," Johnny said. And here is the moment nobody who was in that studio has ever forgotten. Pacino turned in his chair to face Clint directly. And he said, in a voice that was completely controlled, completely measured, and completely clear, "I have always wanted to know what it feels like to walk into a room and have everyone already decided you deserve to be there. Before you say a word. Before you do a thing. I have always wondered what that must be like. The audience did not know exactly what they were hearing. It sounded like a compliment on the surface. But the people in that room who understood the history, and Johnny Carson was absolutely one of them, understood exactly what Al Pacino had just done. He had said, in front of 30 million people, that Clint Eastwood had never had to fight for anything. The studio went very quiet. Johnny Carson looked at Clint. Clint had not moved. His expression had not changed. He sat with that famous stillness of his, looking at Al Pacino, and the whole studio held its breath waiting to see what was coming. Are you ready? Because what Clint Eastwood said next is the reason this night has never been forgotten. 3 seconds. That is how long Clint Eastwood sat in silence looking at Al Pacino. 3 seconds on live television is an eternity. The audience did not make a sound. Johnny Carson did not move. Even the cameras seemed to slow down. Then Clint said, quietly, with no performance in it at all. I let the work speak instead. 6 words. No anger. No raised voice. No attempt to wound or to score a point or to win the moment for the cameras. Just 6 words, spoken the way a man speaks when he is saying something that has been true for 40 years and he has simply never bothered to explain it to anyone before. The silence that followed was the longest silence in the history of that studio. And then Johnny Carson did something that nobody expected. He did not laugh. He did not try to lighten the moment. He did not cut to commercial or steer the conversation somewhere safer. Johnny Carson, the man who had guided 30 years of live television with perfect instinct, looked at Clint Eastwood for a long moment and then looked at Al Pacino. And Johnny said, softly, Al. I think you know what that cost him to build. Al Pacino looked at Johnny. Then he looked back at Clint. And something shifted in his face. Something that was not defeat and was not anger and was not embarrassment. Something that looked, to the people watching, like a man arriving somewhere he had been traveling toward for a long time without knowing it. The audience felt it too. That particular electricity that passes through a room when something real happens in a place that is usually about performance. Al Pacino was quiet for a moment. Then he said, you are right. I do know. He looked at Clint. I have known for a long time. Clint nodded once. Not as a victory. Just as an acknowledgement. The nod of a man who never needed the fight to begin with. Johnny Carson let the silence sit for exactly as long as it needed to. Then he said, gentlemen, I think that is the most honest thing that has ever been said on this stage. The audience applauded. Not the excited applause of a great joke landing. The deep, steady applause of people who have just witnessed something true. What happened after the cameras stopped rolling that night is something the producers talked about for years. Johnny Carson stayed on that stage long after the broadcast ended. He sat with both men at that desk, just the 3 of them, the lights dimming around them, and they talked for almost an hour. The crew quietly found reasons to stay in the building. Nobody wanted to leave. What was said in that hour was never recorded and never repeated publicly in full. But one member of the production staff, who was quietly resetting the stage nearby and could not help but hear, later described it simply. They talked like men who respected each other, he said. All 3 of them. By the end it was hard to remember that anything had ever been complicated. 3 weeks after that broadcast, Clint Eastwood's office received a letter. Handwritten. No letterhead. 3 paragraphs. The letter was from Al Pacino. Clint has never shared the full contents of that letter. He has referenced it only once, in a magazine interview the following year, and only to say, it was honest. And it took courage to write it. Al Pacino has spoken about that period only in the most indirect terms. In a 1997 interview, asked about the experiences that shaped his approach to work in his later career, he said something that the interviewer included almost as a footnote. A comment that seemed casual and was not casual at all. He said, Sometimes the most important thing someone can teach you is how to be quiet. Nobody connected it publicly to that night on The Tonight Show. But the people who had been in that studio knew exactly what he meant. And there is one more piece of this story. The piece that makes the 6 words mean something beyond that one night on one stage. To understand why those words carried the weight they did, you have to understand what Clint Eastwood had given up to be able to say them. He had spent the entire decade of the 1980s watching the industry redefine what serious artistry looked like and position that definition as the opposite of everything he represented. He had read the reviews. He had understood, without self-pity and without complaint, that a significant portion of the critical world had decided he was not serious. That he was reliable product. A face and a squint and a box office number. And for years he had responded to that judgment the only way he knew how. He made the films. He put in the hours. He bet his own money on a western that every studio said the audience no longer wanted. He did not explain himself to critics. He did not give speeches about his intentions. He did not take meetings to manage his reputation. He let the work speak instead. Those 6 words were not a line. They were not a comeback designed for a television moment. They were a life compressed into a single sentence. The most honest answer a man could give when someone questioned whether he had ever really earned what he had. And Al Pacino, because beneath everything he is a man who recognizes truth when it arrives in front of him, heard those 6 words and could not argue with them. Because whatever had happened between them in a Beverly Hills restaurant 3 years earlier, the 6 words were not about any of that. They were about the only thing that either of them had ever genuinely cared about. The work. Johnny Carson retired for good in May of 1992, and that charity broadcast was the last time he ever sat behind that desk. In interviews in the years that followed, when journalists asked him about the most memorable moments of his career, he would mention that October night. Not the monologue. Not the audience reaction. Not the television history of having both men on the same stage. He would mention the 6 words. He said once, "In 30 years of doing that show I heard a lot of things said across that desk. Funny things. Heartbreaking things. Things that changed the way people thought about the world. But I do not think I ever heard anything as simple and as complete as what Clint said that night. 6 words that told you everything about how a man had decided to live. That is the whole story. And if those 6 words landed somewhere real for you tonight, if they touched something you have been carrying, then I want to ask you one question before you move on. What is the work you have been explaining when you could simply be doing it? What is the thing you keep justifying and defending and making the case for, when the only case that ever mattered was the thing itself? Because the most powerful statement any of us can make is not the argument. It is not the meeting or the speech or the perfectly timed response in the corridor. It is the work. It is always the work. Clint Eastwood said 6 words in front of 30 million people and walked away. No anger. No victory lap. Just the quiet confidence of a man who had already said everything that needed saying on a screen somewhere. That is what it looks like to let the work speak instead. If this story moved you, hit that like button right now and subscribe to this channel. Drop a comment below and tell me where in the world you are watching from tonight. I read every single one. And share this with one person who needs to hear 6 words tonight instead of a long explanation. We will see you in the next story.